The alarms on my cruiser scream before I even reach the edge of the Saul system, and my hands are shaking on the control panel before I understand why. My name is Vexthal Koran, and I am a fleet historian of the Draconian Empire. I was not trained for combat. I was trained to record victories, to write the long official histories that children in the core worlds would study for 1,000 years. I never expected my first field assignment to be the disappearance of 41 warships and 6,000 of my own people. The Third Armada left port 8 months ago. They were meant to secure the Saul system, a small, unremarkable pocket of space with one yellow star and a species we had rated as barely worth our attention. The humans of Earth had no faster-than-light travel. They had no fleet that could challenge us. Command called it a formality, a show of strength before we claimed their world's resources for the Empire. Then the messages stopped. There was no battle report, no wreckage, no final call for help. One moment the Armada was transmitting routine position updates, and the next moment there was only silence. A silence so complete that for weeks the Empire believed it was a communication failure, nothing more. I remember the last recorded message myself, because I listened to it 100 times before I left home. A young pilot, laughing, joking about the strange radio chatter coming from the planet below. Music, he said. Voices arguing about something called football. He sounded amused. He did not sound afraid. Then nothing. I volunteered for this mission because I knew the Armada's commander, Dravith Solmar, before he ever wore a uniform. We studied together as younglings. He used to tell me that fear was a tool the weak used to excuse their failures, and that no primitive, unarmed species could ever threaten a draconian fleet. I believed him. Everyone believed him. That is why his silence terrifies me more than any battle report ever could. My cruiser is small, built for diplomacy and record-keeping, not for war. I was given strict orders: observe, record, do not engage, return with answers, not opinions. The Empire does not like uncertainty, and right now, uncertainty is the only thing anyone has. As I cross into the outer edge of the system, my sensors begin picking up shapes, large shapes. My breath catches somewhere between my chest and my throat, because I recognize those silhouettes instantly. Those are draconian hulls. Those are our ships. I slow my approach, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But I do not turn around, because I need to know what happened to Dravith and the 6,000 souls who followed him into this system. The first ship comes into full view, and I feel something cold settle into my stomach. It is intact. Not a single hull breach, not a single scorch mark, not one sign of a weapon ever being fired anywhere near it. The great cruiser floats silently against the black running lights, dim to almost nothing, like a massive predator that has simply gone to sleep in the middle of a hunt. I check my scanners twice, then a third time, because I do not trust what they are telling me. Every ship of the Third Armada is here, all 41 of them, spread in a loose formation that looks almost peaceful, almost deliberate, as if someone parked them here on purpose and walked away. There is no debris field. There is no wreckage drifting between the hulls. There is no evidence of any battle at all, and that single fact frightens me more than 1,000 burning ships ever could, because it means something happened here that our doctrine has no name for. I open a channel to the nearest cruiser, the one my instruments identify as the flagship, the one Dravith commanded personally. My voice comes out steadier than I feel. This is Fleet Historian Vexthal Koran, requesting contact with any surviving crew of the Third Armada. Please respond. Static answers me. Then, after a long pause, something else. Not static, not a distress call, a recording, looping quietly on an open frequency, as if someone left it running and simply forgot to turn it off. It is a voice I do not recognize, a low, calm, human voice, speaking words I do not understand at first. My translation matrix struggles with the rhythm of it, the strange musical quality that draconian speech never has. Slowly, word by word, the translation resolves. Welcome home. Take your time. Nobody is going anywhere. I sit in my chair for a long moment, staring at those words on my display, and I do not move. Nobody is going anywhere. Not a threat, not a warning, a greeting. I try every emergency frequency the Empire uses, every code reserved for crisis situations, every channel that a lost or damaged fleet is trained to answer no matter what. Nothing responds except that same looping message, calm and patient, repeating itself into the void, like a lighthouse built for ships that were never meant to leave. I decide to dock. My protocol training tells me this is against every regulation in the fleet handbook, that I should retreat immediately and report the anomaly for a proper military response. But I think of Dravith's voice, the young pilot's laughter, the 6,000 names on the crew manifest I memorized before I left home, and I cannot make myself turn back. The flagship's docking bay opens for me without resistance, as if the ship has been waiting for exactly this moment. My cruiser slides inside, and the bay doors close behind me with a soft mechanical hum that sounds almost gentle. Power returns to the corridor lights as I step off my ship, section by section, like the vessel is slowly waking up to greet a guest. My scanner reads no hostile presence anywhere nearby, no weapons fire residue, no forced entry anywhere on the hull. Everything looks exactly as it should, except for one detail that makes my hands go cold again. There is no crew, not a single body, not a single sign of struggle. The bridge, when I finally reach it after walking through empty corridor after empty corridor, is spotless. Stations still logged in, personal terminals still glowing with half-finished reports and unanswered messages. It looks less like a warship that lost its crew in battle, and more like a warship whose crew simply stood up one day and walked away. I sit down at Dravith's old command chair, the leather still holding a faint shape where he must have sat for hours at a time, and I pull up the ship's final logs, hoping they will tell me what happened in the moments before everything went silent. The first entries are exactly what I expect: approach vectors, fuel calculations, a brief note about atmospheric composition on the planet below, filed by a junior officer whose name I do not recognize. Routine, boring, nothing that explains what happened next. Then the entries change. Instead of military reports, I find personal notes, casual and warm, written in the log system as if it were a private journal instead of an official record. A crewman named Halric writes about something called a barbecue, a word my translation matrix cannot properly define, only describe as a human method of preparing food outdoors, shared among many people at once. He writes that it was the best thing he has ever tasted, and that a woman named Elena taught him how to use tools he had never seen before. Another entry, from an engineer whose rank I recognize but whose warmth I do not, describes watching something called a sunset from the deck of a small boat, and says he has never felt such quiet in his entire life. I keep reading, faster now, my hands trembling slightly on the console, searching for the moment it all went wrong, the moment the humans revealed some hidden weapon or trap. I search for panic. I search for fear. I search for anything that resembles the beginning of an attack. I do not find it. The entries simply become less frequent, then stop altogether, replaced by nothing but silence in the official record, exactly like the silence that swallowed the entire armada months ago. Whatever happened to my people did not happen with violence. It happened with quiet, ordinary moments, one small human kindness recorded after another, until there was nothing left to record at all. I lean back in Dravith's chair, staring at the darkened bridge around me, and for the first time since I left home, I understand that I am not investigating a battle. I am investigating a disappearance with no explanation the Empire has ever prepared me to understand, and somewhere on the planet below me, 6,000 of my own people are waiting, and none of them, according to every log I have read, ever tried to leave. I close the file, and I sit in the silence of that empty bridge for a long time, listening to the soft hum of a warship that no longer has anyone left to command it, and I ask myself the only question that matters now. What happened to you, Dravith, and why does none of it sound like a defeat? The message reaches the core worlds before I even finish my first full survey of the flagship, and by the time I manage to send my preliminary report, the entire Empire already knows that the Third Armada has been found, intact, silent, and abandoned by its own crew. I did not expect the reaction that follows. Within 2 days, 3 other empires send their own scout vessels towards Saul, each one claiming a right to investigate what they are already calling the greatest military mystery in recent memory. I watched their arrivals from the flagship's sensor array, small ships creeping toward the edge of the system with the same caution I felt when I first arrived, and I wonder if any of them will find the same answers I did, or if they will simply find more silence. News of the disappearance spreads faster than any battle report ever could. I receive encrypted updates from colleagues back home, describing panic spreading through trade networks that depend on safe passage near systems like Saul. Insurance guilds that once offered protection for merchant vessels traveling through contested space suddenly suspend all new contracts, unwilling to calculate the risk of a threat nobody can define. Rival species pull back their own scouting fleets from nearby systems, unwilling to send ships anywhere near a planet that seems to have swallowed an entire draconian armada without firing a single shot. I begin to realize that the silence itself has become more dangerous than any weapon the Empire has ever faced. A fleet destroyed in battle is a tragedy, but it is an understandable tragedy. A fleet that simply stops reporting, with no wreckage and no explanation, is something else entirely. It becomes a shape that every fearful mind can fill in on its own. Rumors move faster than facts. Some say the humans possess a weapon capable of erasing a soul without leaving a mark on the body. Others say Earth is not truly primitive at all, that its lack of visible technology is a disguise hiding something far more advanced than anything the Empire has ever built. I even receive a private message from an old colleague suggesting that the humans might be some kind of trap set by a much older civilization, using Earth as bait to lure powerful fleets into a system with no escape. I do not believe any of these theories, not after what I found in the logs, but I understand why they spread so easily. Fear needs a shape, and when the truth refuses to provide one, people will invent whatever shape frightens them most. I decide that my next step must be a deeper search through the Armada's remaining data, not just the flagship's records, but every vessel I can safely access. If there is a pattern to what happened here, I need to find it before rumor turns into policy, and policy turns into another armada sent to make the same mistake with worse consequences. I spend the following days moving carefully between the silent warships, careful never to venture too close to the planet's surface itself, though I feel its pull growing stronger with every hour I remain in this system. Each ship tells a similar story to the flagship, routine logs, followed by a slow shift into something personal and warm, followed by silence. On the third vessel I board, a smaller support cruiser named for a mountain range on our homeworld, I find something the flagship did not have, a partial video recording, corrupted but not destroyed, dated only a few days before the final entries stop completely. I sit alone in the cruiser's dim communications room and play it. The footage shows a young draconian crewman, barely out of training, standing near what looks like a small human settlement built along a shoreline. He is not wearing his full uniform. His posture is relaxed in a way I have never seen from an active-duty soldier, shoulders low, arms loose at his sides. Beside him stands a human woman with pale hair pulled back from her face, laughing at something he has apparently just said, though the audio is too damaged to understand his words clearly. The recording continues for only a few more seconds before it cuts to static, but in those seconds I notice something that unsettles me more than any weapon could. The crewman is smiling, not the careful, controlled expression the Empire trains its soldiers to display during diplomatic encounters, but something unguarded and easy, an expression I recognize from my own younger years, before fleet discipline taught me to smooth it away. I replay the footage 3 times, searching for any sign of coercion, any indication that this young soldier is behaving under threat or manipulation. I find nothing but 2 people standing together in the sunlight, sharing a moment that looks, for all the galaxy's fear and rumor, disturbingly ordinary. I begin cross-referencing crew manifests against the personal logs I have already gathered, building a slow, careful map of names and moments. A pattern begins to emerge that I am not prepared for. It is not one ship losing its crew to some sudden event. It is dozens of individual soldiers, spread across the entire armada, each one drifting away from their posts gradually, each one leaving behind a final log entry that sounds less like a farewell and more like a beginning. I find an entry from a communications officer named Bressa, describing a human meal she shared with a family in a small town, the kind of detail no military report would ever normally include. She writes about a dish called stew, about a child asking her endless questions about the stars, about laughter that did not feel forced or strange, but simply warm. I find another from a weapons technician named Orvath, describing a conversation with a human engineer about a game called chess, and how strange it felt to lose a match and not feel ashamed of it. None of these entries describe threats. None of them describe captivity. Each one describes something closer to comfort, an emotion so foreign to my training that I struggle to categorize it properly within fleet reporting standards. I begin to suspect, though I am not yet ready to write it in any official report, that the humans of Earth did not defeat the Third Armada in any way the Empire would recognize as a defeat. They simply offered something to my people that our own culture never learned to offer, and my people, exhausted by a lifetime of rigid hierarchy and constant judgment, chose to stay. This thought terrifies me more than any theory about secret weapons or ancient traps, because a weapon can be destroyed and a trap can be avoided, but there is no doctrine in the entire draconian military library for defeating kindness freely given. I attempt one more communication with the automated system still running on the flagship, hoping to find something more concrete than personal anecdotes, some sign of the strategic thinking that must have gone into whatever happened here. Instead, I receive another looping message, different from the first, spoken by a different voice, this one lower and steadier. We never asked your crew to stay. We only asked them to choose. I stare at that message for a long time, turning the words over in my mind, like stones I cannot quite fit into any wall I know how to build. The Empire has never once, in all my years of service, asked me to choose anything. Every path of my life was decided long before I understood what a choice even was. Rank determined my education. Bloodline determined my career. Even my assignment to this mission was not a request, but an order I was expected to accept without hesitation. I begin to wonder what it might feel like to be asked, instead of told, and I immediately push the thought away, because it is not the kind of thought a loyal historian of the Empire is meant to entertain. My scanners alert me to new activity near the edge of the system. 2 more vessels have arrived, unmarked, moving with a caution that suggests they belong to neither the Empire nor any of the other major powers already circling this mystery. I open a channel, expecting silence, and instead receive a brief, polite reply from a small independent trading vessel, whose crew claims they only came to see for themselves whether the stories were true. I ask them what stories they mean. The reply comes back simple and unembellished, that an entire armada vanished into a planet without a single death, and every soldier who vanished seems, by every available record, happier than before they arrived. I close the channel and sit in silence for a long while, watching the dark shapes of the armada drift peacefully around me, and I realize that whatever report I eventually send home will not be believed by anyone who has not stood exactly where I am standing now. The galaxy wants an explanation that fits inside a weapon, a trap, or a trick. I no longer believe the truth will fit inside any of those shapes, and that terrifies me almost as much as it makes me curious to see, with my own eyes, what waits for me on the surface of the planet below. I decide, against every order I have been given, that I need to go down there myself. My hands do not stop shaking as I enter the atmosphere, and I tell myself it is only the turbulence of the descent, though I know that is not entirely true. Fleet protocol is clear on this point. No unsupervised planetary contact without a full security escort and direct authorization from command. I have neither. I have a small shuttle detached from my cruiser, a translation matrix I am not fully confident in, and a growing certainty that whatever waits for me on the surface will not match any briefing I was ever given before this mission began. The landing site I choose is close to the coastal settlement recorded in the corrupted footage from the mountain range cruiser. My scanners show no defensive installations, no weapons signatures, nothing resembling a military presence of any kind. It looks, from orbit, like an ordinary human town, small and quiet, built along a curve of pale sand where the water meets the land. I expect a war zone. I expect a prison camp, guarded fences, soldiers held under duress behind some kind of barrier. I have spent the last 3 days preparing myself for the possibility that I will find horrors here, atrocities hidden behind the calm words of those final log entries, evidence that the peaceful tone of the recordings was some kind of forced performance staged for anyone who came looking. Instead, as my shuttle settles onto a stretch of open ground near the edge of town, I see children playing near a wooden fence, their laughter carrying clearly through my open viewport before I have even fully powered down the engines. I sit in the pilot's seat for a long moment, unable to make myself step outside. A figure approaches from the direction of the town, walking without hesitation or fear, and as the shape grows clearer through the viewport, my breath catches in my throat. It is Draveth. He is not wearing his uniform. He wears simple human clothing, a plain shirt the color of the sky just before evening, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and there is dirt on his hands, the kind of dirt that comes from working soil rather than fighting battles. His posture is different from the commander I remember, looser, more open, the rigid formality of fleet training softened into something I do not have a word for in my own language. He stops a short distance from the shuttle and waits, patient, as if he already knew someone from home would eventually come looking for him. I step outside slowly, my translation matrix humming quietly against my collar, prepared for a confrontation I am not certain I am ready to face. Vexthal, he says, and my name in his voice sounds different than I remember, warmer somehow, though perhaps that is only my imagination working against me. It has been a long time. I ask him the only question that matters, the one I have carried across the entire system to reach this moment. I ask him what happened to his crew. He does not answer immediately. Instead, he gestures toward a small garden beside a modest wooden house, rows of green plants growing in careful lines, and invites me to sit with him while we talk. I hesitate, every part of my training screaming that I should be recording this exchange for official review, gathering evidence, treating this encounter as an interrogation rather than a conversation. Instead, I find myself following him to a low bench beside the garden and sitting down. "Nobody attacked us," he says finally, once we are both seated. "There was no battle, Vexthal. There was no trap. We arrived exactly as ordered, prepared to demonstrate the Empire's strength, and the humans simply asked us why we had come. I tell him that answer is not sufficient, that an entire armada does not simply stop reporting because someone asked a question. He smiles, and it is not the practiced smile of diplomacy I remember from our training years together, but something quieter and more genuine. He tells me that the question itself was not the point. The point was that no human demanded an answer, threatened a consequence, or tried to force compliance of any kind. They simply asked and waited, and let each soldier decide for themselves what to do next. I remind him of everything we were taught, that hesitation in the field is a failure of discipline, that soldiers of the Empire do not simply decide things for themselves in the middle of an active mission. He nods slowly, acknowledging the truth of what I say, but tells me that is precisely why so many of his crew chose to stay. For the first time in their lives, he says, someone gave them a real choice, and let them make it without judgment. I ask him what became of the rest of the crew, the ones who did not choose to remain behind. He tells me, gently, that some returned to their ships and waited, uncertain, hoping for new orders that never fully explained what to do with soldiers who had simply walked away without being pursued or punished. Others left the system entirely, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with the world they had been trained to serve. He does not know exactly how many chose each path, only that no human ever tried to stop anyone from leaving, just as no human ever tried to force anyone to stay. I press him further, asking whether some form of manipulation might explain the behavior he describes, some technology capable of altering thought or clouding judgment without leaving physical evidence behind. He shakes his head slowly and tells me he considered that possibility himself in the earliest days after his own decision to remain. He submitted to medical examination by a local physician he had come to trust, a quiet, careful woman named Marguerite, who confirmed that his mind showed no sign of external influence, no chemical alteration, nothing beyond the simple, ordinary changes that come from choosing a different life. I ask him if he regrets it. He looks out toward the water for a long moment before answering, and when he finally speaks, his voice carries a weight I have never heard from him before, not even during our most difficult training exercises as younglings. He tells me that in the Empire, his worth was always measured against a standard he never chose for himself: rank, bloodline, the judgment of superiors who saw him only as a function to be evaluated, never as a person to be known. Here, he says, gesturing toward the small house behind him, toward the garden, toward the sound of a woman's voice calling out something in the distance that makes him smile before he even finishes his sentence. Here he is simply Dravith, and that has proven to be enough. I do not know how to respond to that, so I say nothing at all. A woman emerges from the house a moment later, the same pale-haired woman I recognized from the corrupted footage, carrying 2 cups of something warm that smells faintly of herbs I do not recognize. She introduces herself as Freya, and though she seems mildly surprised to find a stranger seated beside her garden, she offers me a cup without hesitation, and settles onto the bench beside Dravith as though this arrangement is entirely ordinary. I accept the cup carefully, more out of caution than courtesy, and Dravith notices my hesitation immediately. "It is not poisoned, Vexthal," he says, a trace of dry humor in his voice that I remember from our younger years together. "Nobody here has any reason to harm you, and if they wanted to, they would have done so already, the moment your shuttle landed uninvited on the edge of their town." I ask Freya directly why her people welcomed an armada that arrived, by every account, with hostile intentions. She considers the question carefully before answering, and her answer surprises me more than anything else I have encountered since arriving in this system. She tells me that her people learned long ago that fear breeds more fear, and that meeting an armed fleet with matching aggression would have guaranteed exactly the kind of conflict everyone claimed to want to avoid. Instead, her leaders decided to try something they were not certain would work at all. They decided to offer honesty, patience, and the freedom to choose, and trust that even soldiers raised inside a rigid empire might recognize the value of being treated as individuals rather than instruments of war. I ask her if she was afraid when the ships first arrived in the sky above her home. She admits, without hesitation, that she was terrified, that everyone in her town watched the ships descend with the certainty that their lives were about to change forever, likely for the worse. But she tells me that fear, left unchallenged, only ever leads to more suffering, and her people decided that if they were going to face an ending of some kind, they would rather face it with open hands than closed ones. I find myself unable to formulate a proper response to this, my carefully rehearsed interrogation slowly dissolving into something closer to an honest conversation, the kind I have not had with anyone since long before I joined the fleet's historical division. We talk for hours as the light outside begins to soften toward evening, and Dravith tells me stories I never expected to hear from him, small, ordinary stories about learning to fish along the shoreline, about a local festival involving music and food from cultures across this single small planet, about the strange, quiet comfort of a life where nobody grades your worth against a chart of expectations you never agreed to. I ask him, finally, the question I have been avoiding since I first sat down beside him. I ask him if he still considers himself loyal to the Empire. He is quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands, and when he answers, his voice is careful, deliberate, the voice of a man who has thought about this question many times before I ever arrived to ask it aloud. He tells me that loyalty built on fear is not the same as loyalty built on choice, and that for the first time in his life, he understands the difference clearly enough to know which one he wants to keep. I do not know how to write that answer into any official report the Empire would accept, and as the sun continues to set over a shoreline that was never meant to change the course of an entire military campaign, I begin to understand that the most dangerous thing my people have ever encountered is not a weapon at all. It is simply the truth, offered freely, with nothing demanded in return. I stay in the coastal town longer than I intend to, longer than any part of my training would ever allow me to justify in a formal report, and each day that passes makes it harder to remember why I was so certain, when I first arrived, that I would find something monstrous hiding beneath the calm surface of this place. I spend my mornings walking through the settlement with Dravith, watching the daily rhythms of a community that operates without the rigid hierarchy I have known my entire life. I speak with a man named Callum, an older fisherman who lost none of his gruff humor, despite spending an hour patiently explaining the mechanics of his boat to a stranger from another star system. I speak with a teacher named Iris, who tells me she was initially frightened when several draconian soldiers first asked to sit in on her classes, curious about human history, but who now considers 3 of them close friends. None of these conversations reveal any hidden coercion. None of them reveal any technology capable of altering thought or bending will. What they reveal, again and again, is something far simpler and far more unsettling to everything I have ever believed about strength and weakness. I begin reviewing what remains of Earth's own historical records, granted limited access by a quiet, careful administrator named Godfrey, who explains that his people decided long ago that secrecy breeds suspicion, and that anyone willing to ask honest questions deserves honest answers in return. I read reports written by human strategists in the earliest days after the Armada's arrival, describing their plan not as a trap, but as an experiment in trust, a calculated gamble that beings raised under absolute obedience might respond differently to open hands than to closed fists. I discover that Earth's leadership never expected every soldier to remain. They anticipated that many would return to their ships, confused and uncertain, unwilling to abandon a lifetime of training for an unfamiliar way of living. What they did not anticipate, according to Godfrey's own notes, was how many would choose to stay, and how quickly that choice would spread from one soldier to another, carried not through any broadcast or persuasion campaign, but through simple, ordinary friendship. I attempt to write my official report several times during my stay, sitting alone in the small guest room Dravith's household has offered me, staring at a blank document I cannot seem to complete. Each time I begin, I find myself hesitating over the same sentence, the sentence meant to explain, in clear and objective language, that the Third Armada was lost due to voluntary defection facilitated by unknown psychological methods. I know that sentence is not true, not fully, and I cannot bring myself to submit a report built on a lie, even one the Empire would likely prefer to hear. One evening, sitting beside the same garden where I first spoke with Dravith, I find myself in a quiet conversation with Freya about my own life before this mission, a topic I have never discussed with anyone outside a formal evaluation setting. She asks me simple questions about my family, about whether I chose my career or had it chosen for me, about whether I have ever, in my entire life, made a decision that was not shaped first by the expectations of rank and bloodline. I struggle to answer her honestly, and the struggle itself tells me something I am not entirely prepared to accept. I realize, sitting there in the fading evening light, that I understand exactly why Dravith's crew chose to stay, because for the first time since I arrived in this system, I feel a pull towards something I cannot name, a quiet, persistent temptation to simply remain here, among people who ask questions instead of issuing commands. I push the thought away as firmly as I can manage, reminding myself of my duty, of the report waiting to be written, of the 6,000 names still recorded on a manifest back home that deserves a true and complete accounting. It is this determination that finally pushes me to finish a draft of my report, 3 days later, describing everything I have witnessed as honestly as my training allows. I describe the intact ships. I describe the absence of any weapon or trap. I describe the personal logs, the corrupted footage, my conversation with Dravith, and my conversations with Freya, Callum, Iris, and Godfrey. I describe, as plainly as I know how, that the Third Armada was not defeated by force, but persuaded by kindness, freely offered, with no coercion detected by any method available to me. I am preparing to transmit this report when my communicator activates with an incoming priority message from Fleet Command, informing me that my extended, unsupervised contact with human civilians has been flagged as a serious breach of protocol, and that a recovery vessel has already been dispatched to retrieve me immediately. I am given no opportunity to explain myself, no chance to argue that my findings represent something the Empire urgently needs to understand. The message is brief, formal, and absolute, exactly the kind of communication I have received my entire career, the kind that leaves no room for the sort of honest conversation I have grown unexpectedly used to during my short time on this planet. Dravith finds me shortly after I receive the message, and though I try to keep my expression neutral, he reads the tension in my posture immediately, a skill sharpened by years of command experience that no amount of gardening has managed to soften. "They are recalling you," he says, "and it is not a question." I confirm that he is correct and explain that a recovery vessel will arrive within hours, that I am being ordered to return home before I can complete a full investigation, and that my incomplete report may never receive the serious consideration it deserves once filtered through the layers of fleet bureaucracy waiting to receive it. Dravith is quiet for a long moment, watching the last light of the day settle over the water beyond his garden, and when he finally speaks, his voice carries the same careful weight I heard the first day I arrived. He tells me that the Empire will not want to hear what I have found, because an empire built on obedience cannot afford to admit that freedom might be a more powerful force than fear. He tells me that even if I submit my report exactly as written, with complete honesty and careful evidence, it will likely be buried, dismissed, or quietly rewritten into something safer for those in power to accept. I ask him what he believes I should do instead. He does not answer immediately, and I do not press him, sensing that this is a question he has clearly asked himself many times before I ever arrived to ask it of him directly. Finally, he tells me that the choice, as always here, remains entirely mine to make. I spend my final hours before the recovery vessel's arrival, walking the shoreline alone, turning his words over in my mind, alongside everything else I have witnessed since first descending into this system. I think of the 6,000 names on that manifest, of the families back home who deserve a true account of what happened to their soldiers, of the Empire's rigid insistence that only strength through domination can ever secure loyalty. I think, too, of Freya's question about whether I have ever made a choice that was truly my own. When the recovery vessel finally arrives, its arrival marked by a familiar pattern of engine signatures I have known my entire career, I stand on the shoreline and watch it descend, and for the first time since I left home, I am not entirely certain which decision I am about to make. I know only that whatever I choose next will not be decided for me, and that realization alone feels like the beginning of something the Empire has never once prepared me to understand. The recovery vessel takes me home in silence, its crew treating me less like a returning historian and more like a prisoner under quiet suspicion. And by the time I reach the core worlds, I already understand that the truth I carried across the stars will not survive contact with the Empire's careful machinery of control. I am summoned before a review panel within a day of my arrival, 3 senior officials seated behind a long table, their expressions arranged into the same careful neutrality I once believed was simply professional discipline, though I now recognize it as something closer to practiced denial. I present my report exactly as I wrote it on that quiet shoreline, describing the intact ships, the absence of any weapon, the personal logs filled with warmth rather than fear, and my own conversations with Dravith, Freya, Callum, Iris, and Godfrey. I watch their faces as I speak, and I see, clearly, the exact moment each of them decides not to believe me, or perhaps more accurately, decides that belief itself would be too costly to admit. The senior official leading the panel, a stern woman named Cordelia Ashworth, interrupts my account partway through, asking whether I received any medical evaluation myself during my extended time on the planet's surface, whether I might have been exposed to some undetected influence capable of altering my own judgment. I explain, as calmly as I can manage, that I underwent no such alteration, that everything I witnessed was observed with a clear and functioning mind, and that the simplest explanation, however uncomfortable, is often the truest one. She does not appear to hear me. Within a week, my report is quietly reclassified, stripped of its original conclusions, and replaced with an official summary describing the Third Armada's loss as the result of unknown causes, possibly involving experimental technology beyond current fleet understanding. My own name is removed from the public record of the investigation entirely, replaced with a generic designation, as though the historian who actually stood on that shoreline never existed at all. I am reassigned to a minor archival post, far from any active fleet operations, a quiet corner of the Empire's vast bureaucracy, where uncomfortable questions rarely reach anyone with the authority to act on them. I understand, without needing to be told directly, that this reassignment is not an accident, but a careful, deliberate method of ensuring that my voice, and the truth it carries, fades quietly into irrelevance. I learn, through careful and cautious inquiry among old colleagues, that I am not alone in this quiet erasure. Every other scout vessel that investigated the Saul system in the weeks following my own report returned with strikingly similar findings, and every one of those reports met the same fate, buried beneath layers of careful reclassification, replaced with vague warnings about unknown dangers rather than honest accounts of ordinary kindness. I also learn, through a private message I almost miss entirely among the routine clutter of my new archival duties, that Fleet Command has quietly issued new standing orders regarding any future contact with Earth. No shore leave, no unsupervised communication with human civilians, no prolonged conversations of any kind between fleet personnel and residents of that system, regardless of rank or purpose. I read those orders several times, understanding immediately what they truly represent. An empire that has spent countless generations teaching its people that strength comes only through domination has discovered, quietly and with obvious discomfort, an adversary it has no doctrine capable of defeating. Not because Earth possesses some hidden weapon of overwhelming power, but because Earth possesses something far more difficult to counter, something no fleet, however large, has ever been trained to withstand. The Empire cannot fight kindness with more soldiers. It cannot outmaneuver honesty with better strategy. It cannot punish an enemy that never attacks, never threatens, and never demands anything at all beyond the simple offer of a genuine choice. I spend several months in my archival posting, sorting old records nobody else wishes to review, watching the careful machinery of denial continue its quiet work around me. I write letters to Dravith during this time, though I have no way of knowing whether they ever reach him, describing the slow, grinding erasure of everything I witnessed, and my growing certainty that the Empire will never permit the true account to survive within its own official history. During those months, I also noticed something else, something I do not share with anyone in my new posting, out of fear that even this small observation might mark me as unreliable in the eyes of my superiors. Other names, quiet and unremarkable, begin disappearing from routine personnel rosters across various minor postings throughout the fleet. Soldiers assigned to distant listening posts near systems adjacent to Saul. Technicians stationed on remote monitoring platforms with only occasional contact from command. One by one, without any official announcement, they simply stop reporting for duty, and their files are quietly reclassified, with the same vague language used for the original Armada: unknown causes, unresolved status, no further action required. I begin to understand that the Empire's careful denial cannot actually stop what has already begun, no matter how many orders it issues or how many reports it buries. The truth, once witnessed, tends to spread quietly among those willing to look closely enough to see it clearly, and no amount of official silence can fully undo that kind of understanding once it takes root in a person's mind. One evening, sitting alone in my small archival office long after the rest of the staff has gone home, I finally make the decision I have been circling since that quiet evening on Dravith's shoreline, the decision I was not yet ready to make when the recovery vessel first arrived to bring me home. I begin composing a message, carefully encrypted, addressed to a small independent trading vessel whose crew I remember from my time in the Sol system, the same crew who once asked me, without judgment, whether the stories about a happy, willing armada were actually true. I asked them, simply and honestly, whether they would be willing to carry one more passenger back toward that quiet coastal shoreline, one final time. Their reply arrives within a day, brief and warm, welcoming me aboard without a single question about my reasons. I write this account in the days before my departure, knowing it will likely be discovered and destroyed long before it ever reaches anyone capable of understanding its full significance, and I choose to write it anyway, because some truths deserve to exist somewhere, even if only in a single quiet record meant for nobody but myself. I do not know what the galaxy will eventually decide to believe about the Third Armada's disappearance. I suspect the official story, careful and vague and thoroughly stripped of any real explanation, will remain the accepted account for a very long time, repeated in briefings and warnings across a dozen different fleets that continue giving Saul's system a wide and fearful berth. I know only what I witnessed myself, standing on that shoreline, sharing a quiet drink with people who asked for nothing and offered everything, and I know that whatever waits for me when I finally return to that small coastal town, it will not be captivity, and it will not be defeat. It will simply be a choice, freely made, the first truly free choice of my entire life, and as my transport lifts away from the core worlds toward a system the rest of the galaxy still cannot explain, I finally understand why my old commander never once tried to leave. Some armies conquer through strength, and their victories are remembered in monuments and battle records passed down for generations. But somewhere in a small, unremarkable system, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, an entire armada was won over without a single shot fired, without a single threat spoken, and without a single lie told. I am the 42nd name to make this same quiet choice, though I suspect I will not be the last, and as my transport carries me back toward a shoreline I have already begun to think of as home, I finally write the only conclusion my report will ever truly need. The galaxy cannot explain what happened to the Third Armada, because the galaxy has never once been offered the same simple, honest choice that Earth offered to every soldier who arrived beneath its sky, and until it learns to understand that kind of quiet strength, it never will.